don't receive the grace of God in vain. It seems as if it's possible for Christians, according to the New Testament, having received grace, to then fall short of it or receive it in vain. I know. How dare I say that? What kind of ant's nest am I kicking open? What kind of can of worms have I just uncapped? Let's talk about it. So if you know the story of the Exodus and that first generation that failed to go into the promised land, you know that their story is told in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Deuteronomy really tells the story of the second generation. But in the story of the first generation, you see a pattern. God does miracles, splits the Red Sea, they go through, or whether there is no water, no food, whatever it is, there's a repeated pattern of God having done great things for them, bringing them to another place where there is a crisis, and then they fail to believe God that He would do something good for them in that situation. And so because they repeatedly fail at the end, after this has gone on for a long time, God says, you have now tested me these 10 times. You refuse to go into the promised land that I gave to you because of your unbelief, and therefore you will die in the desert, and it will only be your children that will inherit the promise that I made to your ancestor Abraham, that I would give his descendants this land. People are always surprised that God expects these slaves to have a change of heart, to learn from their experiences, as if the fact that they grew up in slavery, grew up under Pharaoh, maybe grew up watching the worship or even participating in the worship of the gods of Egypt, as if that somehow justifies the fact that they do not learn through repeated experiences with God. Now this brought me to the question about grace. Isn't grace something that we must respond to for the process of grace to have its full effect? Let's just think about the deliverance that God was bringing to Israel. Was He really under an obligation? Well, God made this promise. God predicted that His descendants would go down to Egypt and be there for 400 years. And after 400 years, and having been oppressed, God would bring them up into the land of promise. God didn't have to make that promise. But God graciously, without Abraham or his descendants deserving it, made that promise. So the promise was grace. The fulfillment of that promise is also grace. The mere fact that you have the promise doesn't make the fulfillment of that promise any less grace. God sends a deliverer, God gives them an opportunity to respond, and every time it's as if He is looking to see what they are going to do with the situation. And because they repeatedly fail to respond to the grace that He has shown them in the past, God says to that first generation, you will not enter. So to me, this brings the question, in the New Testament, isn't grace something that we also should respond to, even that was given to us freely? So, just as a side note, this is the second video in a series that I'm doing about grace, and the definition that we are working with here is a slightly expanded definition. It's not the standard unmerited favor definition. We're saying grace is an opportunity or an ability that is given to you without you having deserved it. So if it's an opportunity, you still have to take the opportunity. If it is an ability, then it is still an ability that you have to use or make use of. Building on that basic idea, you have to respond to grace. You have to do something with the grace. I would suggest that grace is supposed to transform. When we receive grace, if the reception of the grace was successful, it is supposed to be a transformative experience. Now, whether or not the grace transforms me is not just up to the person giving the grace. Otherwise, you would have to say that the failings of the first generation, that came out of Egypt to inherit the promised land is God's fault. From his side, he enabled Moses. From his side, he performed the great miracles in the plagues. From his side, he's the one that split the Red Sea. He's the one that every time brings water forth from the rock. He's the one. From his side, God is doing everything necessary. He's extending the grace, yet they are not transformed. Their minds, their way of thinking is not transformed to become people of faith. And the lack of faith is not God's fault. The fact that they received grace but did not respond to grace correctly meant that grace did not have its complete work. So I tell that whole story sort of to prepare our minds to look at the New Testament and the references to grace in the New Testament with different eyes. Because the story of the Israelites coming out of Egypt is used by at least 3, in my opinion actually 4, New Testament authors as an example or a warning or a pattern. Paul even says these things happened to them, referring to the Exodus, as examples to us. So we're going to look at a few of those scriptures so that you know that I'm not just making this up. So 2 Corinthians 6, Christians are supposed to be ambassadors. If you look at chapter 5, Christians are supposed to be ambassadors, bringing a message that we can be reconciled to God. He now turns around to his Christian audience, working together with him, meaning with God. We also appeal to you. Don't receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, and now he's going to quote out of the Old Testament, Isaiah 49, where Isaiah is referring to the events of the desert in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. At an acceptable time, I listened to you, and in the day of salvation, I helped you. See, now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. He's talking to Christians about this day, the present, when they hear the voice of God, being the day of salvation, and urging them to respond to that message. So, are they saved or are they not saved? So the whole idea of progressive salvation, meaning we are born again in our spirit, our minds are being renewed, and then finally our bodies will be resurrected when Jesus returns, is a fairly well-known teaching within the body of Christ. I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole. But he's saying to Christians that it is possible for them, and the warning is don't, but it's possible for them to receive the grace of God in vain. Now, if grace is irresistible and irreversible, which is a doctrine that is very common in the church, especially in the Protestant church, if grace is irresistible and irreversible, then it doesn't make sense for Paul to command them, encourage them, exhort them, do not receive the grace of God in vain, meaning pointless, meaningless. The grace wasn't meaningless, but the way that you responded to it turned it into a useless exercise. The grace would not have its intended effect. So the mere fact that God extends grace does not mean that people take the grace. And even if people take the grace, receive the grace, if they do not continue in that grace, it seems as if that grace could have been extended and given and received in vain. That's the most logical reading of that particular passage. You would have to do violence to the grammar to make it fit with a different kind of doctrine. Now, just to show you that this is not an isolated event, let me read you another portion. The writer of the letter of Hebrews is encouraging them to endure in their faith. So it is possible for them to not endure in their faith. In Hebrews 12, starting from verse 14, pursue peace with everyone and holiness. Without it, no one will see the Lord. I thought holiness is just a grace that is given to us. But apparently, if you're going to live in holiness, if you're going to live in peace with other people, it's something that you have to pursue. It's not automatic. And he says, It's not me. This is not me making this up. He says, if you don't, without holiness, no one will see the Lord. And then he puts the cap on it in verse 15. Make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs up. Wow. Now, you can read the rest of the chapter, and it's all warnings. Once again, he's going to actually talk about that first generation that came out of Egypt. That's what the rest of chapter 12 of Hebrews is about. The Israelites that came to Mount Sinai, and there they received a stern warning that they had to obey God, lest they be destroyed. And he says, how much more? We've come to Mount Zion. We've not come to the mountain of the law. We've come to the mountain of grace. So how much more we should heed this stern warning? And did you notice the wording of verse 15? Make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God. So it's possible. He's talking to believers, and he's saying, among you, as a group of believers, make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God. So people have received grace. They're part of the Christian community. They're people of faith. They're Jews that have come to faith in Jesus, that believe he's the Messiah. If it is impossible to receive grace and then reject that grace or not use that grace, if it's impossible, then why encourage them to make sure that none of them fall short of grace? Okay, that's a second passage. That's a second example that I've just used. Now, by the word of 2 or 3 witnesses, any matter will be established. So I'm going to give you 2 more. Galatians 2 is written to Gentile Christians, meaning non-Jewish Christians, who have become convinced by Jewish Christians that they should keep the law in order to be right with God. Right? The audience is Christian, and Paul is encouraging them, no, I would almost say rebuking them, because they dare to think that having started in grace and faith, they can now complete their journey by reverting to works and to the law. You who are trying to be justified by the law are alienated from Christ. You have fallen from grace. Did I just say people can fall from grace? Apparently. They did not respond to the grace. They did not stay in the grace. Now, he's encouraging them that they can come back from this. He says, you can pull up. You can pull away from the law. You can go back to grace. But if you don't, you are alienated from Christ. Now, I know we're getting into once saved, always saved territory here. I know that's another can of worms that we've just opened. So we've kicked open an ant's nest and we've opened a can of worms. And I'm not going to try to close that can in this particular video. But can you see? This is at least our 3rd witness here. So first letter of Peter, 4th chapter. Just as each one has received a gift or a grace, use it to serve others as good stewards of the varied grace of God. I'm encouraged to participate in hospitality or whatever other area that God has gifted me in. Obviously, because it's possible for me to have that ability and not use it. So the pattern that I see, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, seems to be that we need to work with the opportunities that we are given. Grace does not come to its full expression if I do not respond to it. In fact, I can fall from grace. Do not. You don't have to. This is not a matter that should lead to terror. Maybe it should lead to fear, greater fear of God, so that the mere fact that God is gracious does not lead us to make the mistake that the Gentiles were making in the Roman church, thinking, if grace abounds where sin abounds, then shouldn't I sin more so that grace could even abound more? I started making this series because a friend said, please put your thoughts of grace, about grace, on video and I'll even pay you. So that was a fairly new experience for me, that somebody would actually commission a video. If you want to participate in that way, if you want to commission a video, if you want to just support us and make our work possible, then I would encourage you to follow the links in the description below, there's a Patreon link or a Buy Me a Coffee link where you can either give a one-time gift or become a subscriber.